First, let me just say thank you so much to the School for Public Policy for this invitation to speak, and thank you to Julia and to Kristen and to the whole SPP team. You guys have made me feel very welcome, and I just really appreciate the opportunity. So today I want to talk a little bit about the European racial contract, its connection to how we think about austerity, and what that means in terms of the group that is disproportionately impacted by austerity measures, that of women of color. So in my talk today, what I want to do is first give you a little bit of background, talk about the research background and methods for my project with my colleague Leah Bassel, who's at the University of Leicester, called Minority Women's Activism in Tough Times. What I then want to do is give you a little bit of background on what austerity looks like in both Britain and France, because this is a comparative project looking at minority women's activism in Scotland, England, and France. And so I want to give you a little bit of background as to what austerity looks like in those three countries. Then what I want to do, which is I suppose the meat of the talk, is to talk a little bit about how we might think about austerity as both a manifestation of the European racial contract, as well as how the racial contract is enacted, is enacted through austerity measures. So it's really trying to put together ideas of white supremacy and the various austerity regimes in both France and Britain. And so that's the conceptual middle of the talk that draws on a number of political philosophers. And then what I want to do is show you what this looks like empirically. So this is not just conjecture, this isn't just highfalutin theorizing. This is also about showing you how women of color actually experience, navigate, and seek to subvert the racial contract. And because this is a school of public policy, I'll give you some examples of what this looks like in the policymaking process, give you some examples of what this looks like in social movements, because that's very important, and then give you some examples of how women of color are seeking to subvert or navigate the racial contract. Yeah? Yes. All right, let's do this. There's going to be a lot of randomness like that, so just prepare yourselves. Okay. Right. So what I want to do, firstly, I want to give a little bit of background to the project Minority Women's Activism in Tough Times, because my colleague Leah Bassel and I, we really just wanted to ask and seek to answer a very straightforward question. But what's very interesting, and this is part of the whole point of my talk, is that a question that seems to be very straightforward, but very few scholars, and probably more importantly, very few social movement activists are particularly concerned by. So, I'm still surprised, even though this project has now ended and has ended about 2 years ago, I'm not seeing a lot of urgency around this question that Leah and I were seeking to answer. And it's the straightforward one, which is, what impact are the economic crisis and austerity measures having on minority women and the third sectors in France and Britain? So a very straightforward question. So just very briefly, so we can define key terms, you'll note that I'll switch between minority women and women of color, and there are reasons for that that maybe you can ask me about in the questions. But when I'm talking about women of color or minority women, I'm talking about racialized women who experience hierarchies of class, hierarchies of gender, and hierarchies of legal status. So it's important to understand when I'm talking about women of color, I'm talking about women of color who are born and brought up in Scotland, England, and France, and so who are citizens, but also those migrant women who are asylum seekers or who have gained refugee status, or undocumented women as well. So it's really important to understand I'm talking about citizens as well as those whose citizenship status is in question. So that's the key term that I want you guys to bear in mind when we're talking about women of color. And this was a three-nation comparison, and so we talk about Britain and France, but for the purposes of our project, Leah and I thought it was really important to tease out the differences and the different political roads that are happening in the United Kingdom, because of course United Kingdom is not one country, but it's actually 4 countries. And we see this real divergence in politics that are taking place, particularly between Scotland and England. So you may or may not know that in Scotland, this is unique to Europe, is governed by the Scottish National Party, which is a left-wing nationalist group. So even though nationalism is is stalking Europe at the moment, this is not a reactionary right government. This is a left-wing government that is anti-austerity, pro-migrant, pro-multiculturalist. And this is something that's very different. I can't emphasize enough how the political discourse, particularly of elites, is very different in Scotland. And that is in direct contrast to what's happening in England, where we see that just like in the rest of continental Europe, that multiculturalism is in retreat. And so we wanted to try to kind of to see whether, under the favorable conditions, supposedly favorable conditions in Scotland, what happens to women of color activists in that context. And then in terms of trying to compare England and France, what we wanted to do is, for those of you who are, kind of the proper political scientists, then you'll know that in the citizenship literature that France and England or France and Britain are oftentimes constructed as opposites, right? So opposite contexts in terms of their citizenship regimes. And we think about this in terms of because of kind of Britain and France's particular colonial entanglements. So what that means is, British citizenship has always been more pliable, more open, more pluralistic. And so in the British case, in terms of British citizenship, it means groups have always been able to use their race, their ethnicity, their religion to make claims to the state and make claims to other citizens. And this is a very different kind of a multicultural citizenship regime than we see in France, where France, through, especially this resurgence of laïcité, which is this idea of state-backed secularism, is very difficult but not impossible for citizens to make claims to the state for recognition, for redistribution, in terms of their race, their religion, and their ethnicity. And so it was really important for us to try to understand this very complicated context of different welfare state regimes, different citizenship regimes, and also different austerity regimes, which I'll go on to talk a little bit about in a moment, and say, okay, in this kind of very complex situation, what happens to women of color? What is their fate under austerity? And we can ask if you want to ask more in questions, so we based our study in capital cities, but also big regional cities as well, where there's a concentration of people of color and activist networks, and so that's why we kind of selected the cities that you see on this slide. So in terms of thinking about activism, it was really important for us to look and define activism very broadly, so that we look at activism that women of color undertake with and through the third sector, but also around and against the third sector. And so when we're talking about the third sector, sorry, I'm really like in the middle of this flu crisis, so if I'm kind of like snuffling, I can only apologize, but when we're talking about the third sector, yes, it's notoriously difficult to define, but we're talking about the space between the state and the market, and kind of nonprofit, the nonprofit civil society organizations. And what we wanted to do was try to gather what activism looks like across the spectrum of civil society organizations. So those kind of grassroots, localized, organizations undertaking traditional service provision, service delivery, between those that are mediators between community groups in the state, who do lots of policy advocacy work and do research, but perhaps don't do a lot of kind of direct day-to-day work with local people. And then we wanted to look at those groups that oftentimes provide militant provision, oftentimes for kind of undocumented groups, and actually in the way they operate resemble more social movements. And so we wanted to try to capture that range of possibilities of what the third sector is and how minority women, women of color, organize with, through, and against that sector. And so you see we did our field work over 3 years, from 2011 to 2014, and that means that we've captured a particular way of thinking about austerity and a particular way of, a particular kind of anti-austerity protest. Things have changed a little bit, but not as much as you might think, but hopefully you can ask me about what's changed since the fieldwork finished in questions, because there are some very interesting new actors on the scene which were not present, actually literally did not exist when we were doing our fieldwork. And so you'll see that we kind of undertook semi-structured interviews and focus groups with 85 activist women, various kind of directors of civil society organizations, policy officers, research officers, development workers, social workers, as well as civil servants in local and national government, who had a brief for kind of gender equality, race equality, a brief for the third sector, and also who were had some sort of brief in terms of service provision, so housing, migrants' rights, that type of thing. So as I promised, so this is a bit of background, but I do think it's important in order to kind of, so you understand the kind of the key argument that I'm trying to make with regards to the racial contract. And so I promised to give you a bit of background as to what austerity looks like in France and Britain. Excuse me. So just kind of to be very clear about what we mean when we talk about austerity, it's important to understand that austerity always means two things. It's sorry, I'm like, what does it mean? It's deficit reductions through tax increases and or cuts in public spending. That's all that austerity means. You can choose to raise taxes on everyone or just a few, or you can wield the axe and cut services and cut public spending. And every state oftentimes has a choice, and I'm not looking at kind of what happens in Southern Europe where austerity was imposed, but I'm looking at two states in which there's a form of voluntary austerity that took place. And it's important to understand that the austerity regime in Britain and France is very different than what's happening in Southern Europe at the moment. So in Britain, I can't emphasize this enough that it is a catastrophe. What is happening in Britain in terms of the scale of the cuts, in terms of privatizations, are as important and as dramatic as the setting up of the welfare state after the Second World War. So what's happening in Britain in terms of the pace of the cuts, the speeds of the cuts, but also privatizations, because that's the other thing that's important to understand about austerity. It's not simply the reduction in services, the elimination of services, but it's also the contracting out of the state to the private sector, but also to the third sector as well, which I talk about in another, maybe you want to talk to me about what that means, the very weird implications that has for the third sector. But what's happening with regards to the state is important as setting up of the National Health Service in 1946. It's that dramatic. And you'll see that there's some figures here that under the coalition government in 2010, there are these kind of devastating kind of 18 billion pounds of cuts. And what's really difficult is the cuts to local government, because in the British context, local government is the key deliverer of service provision. And they've done as much cutting as possible in terms of backroom staff, middle management, everything else. And so now they're at the point of having to make dramatic cuts to frontline services. So that's the closure of libraries, closure of after-school clubs, cuts to subsidies in terms of travel, subsidized travel on public transport. It really is quite astonishing. And then with the re-election of the Conservative government, although that government has now changed because of Brexit, every time I present this work, everything has changed. So I'm like, so under this, and it's crazy what's happened. So the previous Conservative government under David Cameron and the then Chancellor George Osborne campaigned in the general election for a further 12 billion pounds of cuts, of which are being implemented. Although there is going to be an autumn statement, I believe tomorrow, in which the new government under Theresa May and the Chancellor Philip Hammond have said they may well reverse or perhaps not implement as many of these cuts, but it remains unclear. So austerity may or may not be coming to an end in Britain. We can't really say, which is helpful for those who are hit the hardest, I think. In terms of France, the situation is very different, so it's important not to treat the cases quite differently, because there has been no sweeping program of cuts like we've seen in Britain. What we have had is kind of a euphemism of kind of what Francois Hollande's government talks about, fiscal consolidation. But what's important is it's not kind of these swinging cuts that we've seen in the United Kingdom. And so what fiscal consolidation means in the French context is about a freeze on public services. It's about not replacing staff when they kind of go off sick or when they kind of quit or they retire. And what we've seen is kind of, it's the more stringent eligibility requirements to get some sort of certain kinds of benefits, in particular out-of-work benefits or housing benefits, that type of thing. But what we've seen, particularly in relation to the third sector, has been how cuts to kind of local government have been passed on to them, and thus their service provision has changed. So kind of we talk about associations in the French context, and they've had to make do with these cuts that have been passed on. These kind of sort of cuts have been passed on to them from the from central government. So that gives you a little kind of context what we talk about when we're talking about austerity. So you're like, okay, well, we were here to talk about the racial contract. Where's that coming? It's coming. I promise you it's coming. So let's talk about that. So I suppose what's important is kind of presenting those figures about cuts to local government, cuts to public transport, all these kinds of things. You're like, okay, great, but what does that mean in terms of women of color? What that means is we have to understand always how austerity measures have asymmetrical impacts. They have asymmetrical effects, and you're missing the story of austerity if you don't take seriously how austerity is racialized, it's gendered, and it's classed. Oftentimes when we talk about austerity, we oftentimes only talk about the class implications, the homogenous working class, things are terrible, the homogenous poor, things are terrible for them, or we talk about women, but when people are talking about women, they really mean white working class and white middle class women, and poor women of color get kind of thrown under the bus yet again by feminism. And so what's really important to understand is austerity has a disproportionate impact on women of color precisely because of their patterns of paid and unpaid care work. And that's really important to understand, is that women of color pay a price by their patterns of caring. And so what I want to talk to you a little bit about is about what that means, what are the implications of that. And so women of color are disproportionately disadvantaged by both the crisis but also austerity because of their particular relationships to the social welfare state. Because women of color are more likely to use public services. So women of color are more likely to send their children to public school or state school, not likely to kind of go send their kids to a fee-paying school, more likely to use public transport, more likely to use the locally subsidized child care service, more likely to send their child to to some sort of kind of socialized medicine rather than go private and have private insurance. And so what we see is when austerity then disproportionately hits those who have no alternative to buy their way out of austerity. So this is a deeply classed effect, but it's also gendered and it's also racialized. Linked to that is the ways in which when you cut the state, you're also cutting women of color's employment. Because what we see is women of color, for the most part, are more likely to be employed by the state, either locally or the national state, because of the feminized caring professions, teachers, nurses, social workers, all that type of thing. So when you're cutting the state, you're not just cutting service provision, but you're also cutting women of color's jobs. And then, particularly in relation to the experiences of migrant women, what you see is that when you're cutting and privatizing the state, what you're also doing is further destabilizing migrant women's labor, because migrant women are more likely to be subcontracted to the state because they're the ones providing your catering, your cleaning, and your low-paid, low-status care work. And so what you see here then is because of the patterns of caring and care work, looking after children, but also looking after older adults, we see that women of color pay a heavy price. And so when we seek to kind of erase or deny, or in fact just kind of not think it's relevant talking about race, you're really missing the big story here in terms of austerity. And what I'm suggesting is that is symptomatic of the racial contract at work. Excuse me. So, because there's a sting in the tail when it comes to austerity, which I think is really important to understand, that the very nature of talking about austerity, so this moment that takes, this kind of regime that takes hold, this seemingly hegemonic policy intervention that kind of Europe and parts of America, because America is a very localized kind of state, have undertaken, we see that there's a sting in the tail because the ways in which we even frame and talk about the crisis and austerity actually seek to erase and undermine minority women or women of color's persistent precarity. Because what's important to understand is even before 2008, so before the 2008 economic crisis, and certainly even before 2010, when we started to see a lot of the austerity regimes being implemented, we know that women of color have experienced an almost permanent state of precarity. Women of color are more likely to be living in poverty. Women of color are more likely to be over-concentrated in low-skilled, low-paid work, regardless of their class position, regardless of their educational outcomes. So again, all the people wedded to that idea of class, hate to tell you, doesn't explain what's going on with women of color, which is why intersectionality is important, that you have to understand class, race, and gender if you want to understand what's going on in terms of who's in precarious work and why. But what's important to understand is that kind of women of color's precarity doesn't kind of feature prominently when we think about who is in precarious work, who lives precarious lives, who is racked by economic anxiety and economic insecurity. Because women of color's precarity is either not seen, is invisible, ignored, or soon to be somehow banal in the sense of, oh, that's just the way it is. Maybe if they didn't have so many kids, or maybe if they learned the language, or maybe if they just worked hard enough. It's kind of seen as the status quo. And that is the racial contract at work. Because what I would ask you to do is, if you haven't done so, please read Guy Standing's very excellent book called The Precariat. And then please do look for how he talks or lacks or does not talk about issues to do with race and gender. And that gives you an idea of who is included and who is excluded from this idea of the precariat. Because what it exposes, and similar studies in this vein demonstrate, is that when we're talking about precarity and we're talking about the impact of austerity, what we're really describing is the exceptional experiences of the economically privileged. We're not really concerned about those who have been consigned to lives of almost permanent precarity. Because if we were, then I would have thought that we would have much more scholarship about why women of color are, have historically higher unemployment rates, historically higher levels of poverty than their white counterparts. But that doesn't seem to be part of the story. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why is that? So, yes, I'm being very hard on a lot of scholarship and also a lot of activism and policymaking, but I think it's the only way, to be honest, if we can kind of try to illuminate what's happening here. And so we're kind of faced with an irony when we're talking about the economic crisis and we're talking about austerity, because the very people who are hit hardest, the most marginalized, those who are who really have to kind of deal with issues of kind of institutionalized economic insecurity are erased in policymaking, are erased in scholarship, and also are erased in social movements and the kinds of claims various social movements make with regards to austerity. Because what we see is that women of color are either kind of constructed as, are dismissed as irrelevant alien others who are kind of not really present in public space unless they disrupt the racialized social order. Because you don't really hear from women of color, you don't really kind of hear them named or really kind of hear about their concerns unless they kind of been captured by the white gaze. And so you see this idea of, this kind of whole, moral panic that took place in France over the summer over the burkini ban, right? You're like, is this really the biggest issue facing women of color or even Muslim women in France? Probably not. But the only time you actually hear from women of color in this context is when they're violating the normative whiteness of Frenchness. So that's something that's very important. The other thing that's at play here is how intersectional politics, those politics based on on race, class, and gender, sexuality, disability, legal status, how those can be so easily dismissed as quote-unquote identity politics that somehow disrupt and fracture the left, because we know that the real work, the real hard work, is really in class-based work and populist work. And these crazy women and these kind of women of color coming in with their talk of race and gender and their special pleading, this is a way that undermines their claims. This is absolutely a way of undermining their claims. And I'll show you this because this can be proven empirically. So I'll be sure to, I'll show you that as well. But then also scholarship doesn't get off the hook here, because I can't tell you how many conferences I've gone to on gender and the crisis in which gender is read as white women. And when I kind of raise my hand and go, where are the other women? You go, oh yes, that's important. And then no one does anything about it. And I'm still one of my colleague and I think there are now 3 other people, seem to be the only people doing this work. But if we're serious again about who is most marginalized, why are these experiences, why are these perspectives invisibilized? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. So I promised you we'd talk about the racial contract, and I'm doing so right now. So because I think it's important that we really take seriously this idea of exclusion, this idea of invisibility, this idea of dismissal, and this idea of denial. So what explains what's going on here? And I think the political philosopher Charles Mills is really onto something in his idea of the racial contract. And so when he talks about the racial contract, he defines it as such. He says, quote, "The racial contract is not a contract between everybody, we the people, but just the people who count. Just between the people who count, the people who really are the people, we the white people." And he talks about how in the racial contract that people of color are objects and not subjects of the contract. And I think that's really important because it really it highlights a number of different issues, and it really kind of puts it really focuses our attention on trying to understand the operation of white supremacy. Because to be honest, there's no kind of real explanation as to what's going on here. And we need to kind of take seriously the issue of the operation of white supremacy. So in terms of the racial contract, Charles Mills talks about how the racial contract is an agreement that all white people enter into either implicitly or explicitly. And I think that's important, that someone doesn't just kind of knock on your door one day and say, "Hello, would you like to enter into the racial contract?" You're like, "Oh, yes, that sounds very interesting." No, he's saying that something else quite insidious takes place. And what he says is, in entering the racial contract, either implicitly or explicitly, this is a way of reproducing and defending white supremacy. And he talks about the importance of trying to make visible the idea and the practices of white supremacy, because this is the unnamed political project that shapes and continues to shape our social world. Because guess what? If you want to understand what's happening in France at the moment, if you want to understand what's happening in America, so please be sure to ask me about Trump. I'm so excited to talk about Trump. Be sure to ask me about that. If we want to understand the politics behind Brexit, we have to take seriously this idea of white supremacy, that no, it really is not about economic anxiety. It really is about reasserting a racialized social order, and I'm happy to defend that position very strongly. And Charles Mills talks about the importance of understanding how white supremacy is a process of the unequal distribution, a differential distribution of material wealth, of opportunities, of rights, of duties, and burdens. That's what's really important here. And it's a process, the racial contract is a process of establishing a racial state. And so we oftentimes think of a racial state in very explicit terms, South Africa, or in fact America, where we can't stop talking about, as a Texan, America just can't stop talking about race, right? But in Europe, we don't well, I guess you guys, but I'm not European, but I'll say we. But in Europe, we like to believe that somehow this is an issue that's not as important, or is in fact not present, because class takes such prominence. But what I would argue is that the ways in which class takes prominence is a way of reasserting the racialized social order. Because what we see is that the racial contract, when trying to establish a racial state, insists on and reproduces a racialized social order that secures the domination of white groups. Because again, let the data be your guide here, that even that when we look at the outcomes, I suppose for me the key data point here is about the outcomes when you compare women of color and their counterparts. And I'll use Scotland as an example that is kind of very typical for the rest of Britain and France and various other European countries. That regardless of educational outcomes, I've mentioned this before, but I just want to kind of underline that point. That regardless of educational outcomes, women of color are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed or in part-time insecure work. And so what can explain that? What can explain this? That you have all the resources to compete in the labor market and yet still can't get ahead. Something's going on here, and we have to take seriously the issue of the racial contract. And so Charles Mills is very clear about saying that the racial contract operates in particular ways. So as I was saying, someone doesn't knock at your door one day and say, let's all participate in the racial contract. What happens is that it operates through an epistemology of white ignorance. And so he talks about this, and it's really interesting. I kind of strongly encourage you to read his work, because what he talks about is white ignorance is an agreement to misinterpret the world, which I think is very interesting. It's an agreement to misrepresent the ways in which misrepresent experiences of people of color, to deny the experiences of people of color, and to dismiss the experiences of people of color. But white ignorance is validated, and I think this is so interesting, is he argues that white ignorance is always validated by a white epistemic authority. And so you can be secure in not knowing, you can be secure in your ignorance because it will be validated by some sort of epistemic authority, whether that's the media, whether that's politicians, whether that's policymakers, whether that's your university degrees where you don't seem to read any women or women of color. All of those things reinforce an epistemology of not knowing and also a refusal to know. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. Oof. So I suppose what I now want to do is talk to you a little bit, because Gloria Becker, who is an absolutely excellent, I guess we call her maybe an anthropologist, but maybe a sociologist. I'd like to claim her for sociology, if that's okay. Because I think what's really interesting about the racial contract is about how it creates and produces its own logics of not knowing, of denial, and a refusal to know. And Gloria Becker talks in great detail, and it's very interesting, about the effective relations that the racial contract creates, and how various kind of emotions are withheld from people of color, kind of empathy, solidarity, understanding, which is really interesting. And these are structures of feeling, right? So that we do not extend, we don't extend to people of color. And I just, just as an aside, just in the wake of the kind of the Trump election, you'll know that there's been all this hand wringing about, how do we understand the white working class and their anxieties? How do we understand the lure of the far right for the white working class? That's the racial contract at work that focuses attention on trying to understand the voting behavior of the white working class, rather than say, and this is a real statistic, the 94% of black women who voted for Hillary Clinton. This is the idea of how the effective relations, where the need to understand what's going on with different parts of the electorate is only extended to two particular groups. That's how we see the racial contract at work. So, bringing this back to issues of austerity in Europe, what we see is how women of color's unremarkable poverty, as I say, for example, 40% of British, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi women and children are living in poverty in Britain. But when we talk about precarity, their experiences of poverty are invisibilized in our discussions of policy, our discussions of politics, and certainly amongst social movement activists. So the rendering of women of color's poverty and inequality is seen as unremarkable. This is the ways in which the racial contract operates. And so what I want to do is show you what this looks like empirically. So this is what I promised to do, and I'm kind of coming towards the end now of my talk. So, as I said, what I want to do is show you two examples of how the racial contract operates in policy, two examples of how the racial contract operates in social movements, and then two examples of how women of color are seeking to subvert the racial contract. Because I was working with students yesterday, and they were like, oh, it's so depressing. Can't you please give us something nice to think about? So I was like, all right, I'll free you guys because I love you. We'll end on hopefully a positive note, maybe. No, maybe. So we'll see. So, what I wanted to do was start in Scotland, because I do think it's important, because Scotland is often, especially on the left, is often pointed to as an exemplar of what the left could be when it's in power. And so as the left is slowly being voted out of power across the United States and Europe, kind of poor Scotland kind of stands up as some sort of exemplar. And so what I wanted to do is show you kind of what happens, what's the fate of women of color in a very favorable context. So remember, as I was saying, the Scottish National Party is anti-austerity, pro-migrant, pro-multiculturalist, says all the right things in terms of racial justice, gender justice, LGBT rights, all the rest of it. So what happens to women of color in this context? So this is a Scottish Asian activist based in Edinburgh who is an anti-violence against women activist. And she said this about her experience with policymakers. She says, quote, if policymakers wanted to listen to us, they would come to us when they've written 0 of their policy, not when they've written 99% of it. So when it comes to minority women's issues, issues or minority people's issues more widely, we are the afterthought always. And so I think it's really important to understand what's going on here in terms of even in this very favorable context, when you kind of go, the government is open. Policy advocates reported to me in the course of my fieldwork that, their access to policymakers was incredible. People really wanted to talk about social justice. They really wanted to talk about these issues. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty of crafting and enacting policy, that we default to this normative whiteness, where we say all the right things in rhetoric, but in practice, the issues of women of color are erased in policymaking. So that's the first example. The second, I wanted to show you kind of the very particular case of what happens oftentimes in France, because I think it's actually really interesting. And this is, as I say, a very kind of particular issue that happens in France and not so much replicated in both Scotland and England, but I thought it might be interesting for you guys to see. I'll read the quote first and then kind of explain what's going on. So this, I should point out, is a white French woman who is an advocate on behalf of undocumented migrant women in Paris. And so she says this, quote, "One thing that is certain is the prism of foreign women as victims of violence. We're able to have more of an impact with politicians because no one supports violence. It's an angle of attack that's interesting and useful." So there's a particular issue that happens in France because of, returning to what I was saying before about the official policy of secularism, of laïcité, where it's incredibly difficult, but as I say, not impossible, to make claims on the basis of race, ethnicity, and religion in public space. And what policy advocates have found is that they have to collude with the racial contract. They have to collude with white ignorance in order to have a public discussion about the experiences, in this case, of migrant women. Because part of the issue that's going on here is that oftentimes politicians and policymakers don't really want to hear about kind of women of color's experiences of poverty, women of color's economic insecurity, because that doesn't kind of fit with what they know, or rather what they don't know about women of color. But what does fit are experiences of female genital mutilation. What does fit are experiences of forced marriage. What does fit are people being forced to wear the hijab and the niqab and the burkini and the burqa and everything else. And so in order to get politicians around the table, and this advocate was very clear about saying this is the case for folks on the right as well as on the left. And this is what's really important for the socialists as well as kind of the UMP and the Les Républicains. They have to collude with white ignorance, that in order to talk about migrant women's issues, they have to actively misrecognize and misrepresent migrant women's experiences in order to get a foot in the door, and thus reinforcing and reproducing that racialized social order. It's a very particular problem in France. We don't really see that happening so much in the English and Scottish cases because of particular kinds of the particular kinds of citizenship regimes I was talking about at the beginning. So that's what happens in policymaking. Two examples of what happens in policymaking. What I want to do is show you what happens in social movements. So this is a black trade unionist in London who is a woman not to be messed with. And so when she's saying this, man, it's ugly out there. So she's talking about a very famous anti-austerity movement, and this has been her experience in trying to interject intersectional politics into a movement that is dominated by class-based discussions and populist discussions. She says this, quote, "Just because it's an anti-cuts movement doesn't mean to say there's not racism within it. You have to explain it and spell it out to white activists. Now, these are supposed to be people that are supposed to understand what true equality means and what oppression is, but the reality is they don't really understand it." So you might say, okay, the previous examples, you kind of go, oh, policymakers, politicians, they get it wrong, they're not supposed to know, they have a party line to hold on to, who really cares, and all the rest. It's interesting, but whatever. Let's get down to our, supposed allies in struggle, right, our fellow travelers. What we see is, guess what? We see the same issues at play in social movements, spaces that are meant to be spaces of kind of radical democracy. We're meant to be imagining radical futures. Oftentimes, what we see is the racial contract enforced in ways that exclude women of color's alternative knowledge. We argue that it's kind of counter-hegemonic knowledge to say if you're serious about understanding austerity, we have to take seriously the kind of asymmetrical and intersectional effects based on race, class, and gender. For this activist, it was not possible, and we see this replicated in other anti-cuts movements as well, in both Britain and in France. I wanted to just return very briefly to the example of Scotland, because good old Scotland, because you kind of go, well, maybe you're being a bit unfair to Scotland, because, again, policymakers, politicians, they say one thing, do another, all the rest of it. Let's see, because remember, because this research took place in this kind of moment of radical democracy in Scotland in the run-up to the Scottish independence referendum. And so this is where you see civil society mobilized in ways that were really quite unprecedented. And you saw that represented in terms of the electorate, in terms of who came out to vote for the Scottish referendum. People who had never voted before came out to vote. And what we saw is they stayed at home at the 2015 general election. So new people, there were new actors on the scene as a result of the Scottish independent referendum. And so we wanted to say, well, okay, that's really exciting because the referendum intersects with anti-austerity movement. So what happens to women of color in this really exciting space of radical democracy? You guessed it, right. So this is what a West African migrant woman was talking about in her experiences in an anti-cuts movement in Glasgow. She says this, quote, "Ethnic minority groups are trying to drive in their humble way different causes, but how do you link with the local people, the indigenous people? It's almost impossible. You don't seem to find an avenue to join in when people are doing their thing, so you somehow find yourself on the sidelines all the time. Even if you did your thing, you won't be able to attract them," she's talking about white Scots, to come with you because it's so segregated. And so there's something going on here about the presence, the presence of a white normativity in left-wing spaces that makes it incredibly difficult, and I wouldn't say impossible because you see kind of women of color in these spaces, but having to make lots of compromises to kind of exist in these spaces dominated by populist or class-based politics. And again, just the irony of this situation given when we see the asymmetrical impacts of austerity. So I promised I'd end with a couple of hopefully positive notes. So I can only have a couple slides left and I'm almost done, promise. So I wanted to show some of the ways in which women of color are trying to subvert the racial contract. And hopefully this will pre-answer some questions about how to be a good ally and how not to reproduce this and all the rest of it. Because I think oftentimes we can overthink what is to be done here. Because I think what we see, one of the key issues is that a key way of trying to subvert the racial contract is about recentering the knowledge, experiences, and perspectives of women of color. Sounds simple, but it's in fact one of the most difficult things that you can do. But this is the path to solidarity. So this is, I think, a really kind of evocative quote from a French-Moroccan activist in Paris and talking about some of the undocumented migrant women with whom she worked. She says, quote, "To work with a woman is to take responsibility for her life in my hands. This means to help her get by, and I will fight for her. So I succeed with her or I lose with her, but her loss is my loss. I cannot see their destruction because it is unbearable for me. When I work, it is with my guts, unfortunately or fortunately." So talk about, one of the ways we're talking about defining solidarity is this idea of shared fate. And I think this is really important. You really see this evocative, kind of emotive example of this idea of shared fate in terms of gender justice and racial justice, that we rise or stand together. But part of this is about saying and taking seriously the views, perspectives, and experiences of women of color. So one last example, and then I'm finished. And I just wanted to show what again, another strategy of subverting the racial contract, and that is through, perhaps unsurprisingly, but maybe surprising, I don't know, unsurprisingly through dialogue and community building. And so this is another anti-violence against women activist who talks about the survival strategies and how you build solidarity through community and dialogue, but focus specifically on how are you going to feed your children, how are you going to keep the lights on, how are you going to get a break from looking after your children so you can go and engage in some sort of leisure activity. So she says this, quote, "The pressures are higher on women to get out of the welfare system. I think they are talking to each other a lot more about how they're managing financially and managing their goals and ambitions. I think they're finding ways of connecting with each other. So when they speak to each other, when they speak to each other, they are beginning to dream a little bit more, have a lot more ambition, and finding ways of working together." So there's a lesson here about how one might imagine possible futures, and that lesson here is about saying, how do we engage in dialogue, on non-patronizing, non-hierarchical ways, and how do we build community, and it's through community that we can, think through kind of collective problems and also think through possible collective solutions. So what I wanted to do is talk, because this is where, so this project is over. My colleague Leah Bassel and I, we have a book coming out, and I'm thinking about where's next, and what are the broader implications for this project. And I've been thinking a lot about complicity, because part of the reason why we don't like talking about white supremacy and the racial contract, because not only is it deeply disturbing, but also there's this whole European thing that race doesn't matter here and all the rest of it. But the bigger issue is that when we talk about the racial contract, it makes us all complicit. And I think that's the issue, that we deny, we dismiss, we do all of these things because we don't want to be racked by guilt. We don't want to be the one to say we're actively participating in upholding a racialized social order. And so we don't talk about these things and kind of wish they weren't so. And I'm wondering about whether then running away from complicity, that we can actually think about ways of subverting this idea of complicity, saying, is it in this way that we're not all equally complicit? Look, that's not what I'm saying. But we are all compromised. All of our politics are compromised in one way or another. I'm very clear about, I should probably be doing more and saying more about kind of the record number of migrant deaths in the Mediterranean this year. I'm complicit in not talking more about that, right? So we're all compromised in some way, and I'm wondering whether that compromise can somehow be converted into forms of solidarity, and whether that's kind of maybe a new path for thinking about taking seriously women of color's experiences and the ways in which they subvert the racial contract. Okay, thank you.